Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the closing session of ZJLF at the British Library Knowledge Centre Theatre. We are delighted to introduce The Theft of the Raj, the British Empire in India. Please ensure your phones are on silent and there is no flash photography allowed in the venue. Please welcome Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar, Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre.
These lights are in my eyes.
Are they? Okay, we just saw that.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm presuming this applause is for them because I'm just going to introduce them and go. But I'm Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre at the London School of Economics. This panel is being co-organised by the British Library and the South Asia Centre at the London School of Economics. It's part of a series that we've been running over the last year called Colony as Empire. I think it says at that corner bold over there. But over the last year, various events in this series that we've hosted at the London School of Economics have highlighted the intense and organic link that existed between colonial and imperial powers that visited India over the centuries and its colony in South Asia. I should clarify here that this is undivided India that we are talking about, the Indian subcontinent. This complex relationship, as you must know, has several views and perspectives. The events in this series therefore consciously look to reposition the colony as an integral part of the history of the empire, and not as a history unfolding out there, especially in this year 2017, which marks the 70th years of the independence of two countries in the subcontinent. We are very delighted to co-host this with the British Library under the auspices of the Jaipur Literary Festival here today. It is my privilege to introduce our guests. To my extreme left, Mr. Roy Moxham, an independent scholar who has established himself as a writer of the history of the subcontinent from unique perspectives, be it tea, outlaws, or the Great Hedge of India. His latest book, The Theft of India, The European Conquests of India, 1498 to 1765, is the focus of today's discussion. To my immediate left is Mr. Shashi Tharoor, parliamentarian and author of several books, most recently of Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. It's useful to mention here that in case you are wondering what the British did do to India according to Shashi, you may be interested to know, as a relevant aside, that the same book is published in India and is called An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India, about... I didn't let on anything. The panel is...
Actually, the British title gets the same reaction in India.
The panel is moderated by Dr. Mukulika Banerjee. Mukulika is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the London School of Economics and is Founding Director of the South Asia Centre. Mukulika's most recent publication is Why India Votes, and she is currently completing a monograph based on 15 years of ethnographic data collected from rural voters in India and their multivalent engagement with elections, which examines ideas about how popular participation and ethics of civility and citizenship, key ideas associated with a democratic ethic, how they take root in India. Thank you.
I'll turn around a bit.
Thank you, Nilanjan. Welcome, everybody. I can feel the anticipation in this room. Before we start, can I just request the control room, if you can dim the lights on Roy a little bit. It's in his eyes.
Yeah,
that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I know you're not here to... I'm really going to take my role as moderator quite seriously. I know you want to hear these two gentlemen here, and they have these wonderful two books that have come out. I think it is important, before we start going back in time, and we'll go back a long way in time because Roy's book starts in 1498. We are, all of us in some ways, engaged with contemporary India in our own ways, reading the news, consuming it, thinking about it, discussions. That's what JLF is about. The South Asia Centre at LSE does this. And what I think at the back of our minds must inform this discussion about the past is what we are doing with the present. And the news today, I think all our social media feeds are full of an image of a man who was murdered yesterday in Jharkhand, begging for mercy. This is the India that we own and have created and are managing and shaping. And that, how we are doing that, what we are doing with our independent India that we are celebrating the 70th birthday of, is something I think that should inform these discussions as we talk about the past as well. And I think it'll be, Shashi is of course a parliamentarian, and therefore contemporary politics informs a lot of these discussions of history. That's what history is about. And Roy, some of you may know, and I hope some of you have read The Great Hedge of India, which I read when it came out, and is an absolutely delightful read. But Roy's had a very long engagement with India, spending lots of time living in India. A great personal friend of Phulan Devi's, has traveled in various parts of India and has made friendships. So I think the discussion of the past is very much, in various different ways, between the two writers, shaped by an engagement with the present. And I think that's going to come out in our discussions. There's a wonderful quote in Shashi's book which makes the connection with LSE, which of course is co-curating this with ZJLF and the British Library. There's a quote by George Bernard Shaw in your book. And Shaw, of course, as some of you will know, was one of the 4 founders of the London School of Economics. And it says, he says, when an Englishman wants something, he never publicly admits to his wanting it. Instead, his want is expressed as in quotes, a burning conviction that it is his moral and religious duty to conquer those who possess the thing he wants, unquote. So this idea, I think the fact that it says Englishman absolves one of the co-directors of JLF. No doubt this is going to be used by him in his defense, but that again is an interesting conversation, the dynamics between the different aspects or different parts of Britain. Could we have had the empire without the Scots, in fact? And probably a lot of people would say no. What I have requested our guests to do is some of you, I think Shashi's book, how many of you own a copy of Shashi's book? And how many of you have actually read it? How many of you don't own the book and have read it? That's really heroic. And there is somebody, fantastic. I think Shashi, you owe her a copy in that case. We've talked about Shashi's book in London at various forums. In fact, we had a conversation at LSE. But I think the reason for putting these two things together was, of course, the periodization is one thing. And that's why we will start with Roy, whose book, The European Conquests of India, 1498 to 1765. And then Shashi brings it up really right up into the contemporary, addressing things. Should we have a campaign for the Jallianwala Bagh centenary, for instance, and so on. That's one. But secondly, I think it is worth noting that this is historical research done in a particular manner and written in a style that makes it accessible to anybody who reads English. And I think that is the real joy, it's a real merit of having books that you can rely on the evidence that it's based on. It's properly researched and made accessible. It is something that academics try to do, sometimes succeed, not very often. But having these books in the public space is so important. So I'm going to invite Roy to talk about his book for about 10 minutes, so you hear what the nub of the argument is. Here's some fantastic stories of individuals in the book, and I hope you will tell us at least one of them. And I know one of the characters, you've written a whole novel about her, in her voice. And Shashi, you'll do the same straight after. We'll see if there are questions you want to ask each other, and then we'll start taking questions quite early, because I can imagine this audience will have questions. So over to you, Roy.
All right. What I might do, I'm starting off with the Portuguese, and just to give you an idea of what it was like. I mean, Vasco de Gama arrived in 1498 in Calicut. Now, Calicut was probably the major entrepot running down that coast. And there was any amount of ships were coming in from Arabia and other places, picking up stuff in Calicut and taking it off. And then what you'll see is, as this story develops, is that these other countries then tried to impose a barrier there with their ships, so other ships could not come down to Calicut or indeed anywhere else in India. And so whoever it was, whether it was the Portuguese or the Dutch or whatever, they had a monopoly of the trade. And because they had a monopoly, they were able to buy it cheaply. So that's really one of the key things. I mean, Vasco de Gama came on his first trip. He came to Calicut, and then he came again. And to give you an idea of what kind of people we're talking about, I've got a quote here when he arrives in his second trip, which is 1502, and one of the people on his ship has written about what happened, and he says, "We took a ship from Mecca." When he says we took a ship, he means we captured a ship, right, from Mecca, right, in which there were 380 men and many women and children. And we took from it fully 12,000 ducats, with goods worth at least another 10,000. Then we burned the ship and all the people on board with gunpowder. So, that's the kind of start of the Portuguese thing. And, he had originally come to, as I say, to Calicut, and then, which was this peaceful haven, and then 2 years later, they'd come back, they'd captured any ships going into there, slaughtered their crews, turned their cannon on Calicut, destroyed all its houses, killed its inhabitants, and the Portuguese terror had started. And the Portuguese, they actually took very little land in India. I mean, they've got Goa, obviously, but they didn't but what they did do was build a lot of forts. In fact, they probably built too many forts because, the population of Portugal at this time was really very small. People don't realize this. It was only 1 million people. And slightly later in the narrative, they've also got to think then about, they've got Brazil as well. So, finding enough troops and people to go to all these places, it was a severe strain, and ultimately that proved impossible, really, to maintain. But it is amazing that a country with such a small population should do that, really. So, and they ruled right through, for 100 years or something without any competition because they were in charge of the seas. They had the most powerful navy in the world. Well, they didn't have, actually, the Spaniards had another navy which was powerful, but the Pope had divided the world into two spheres of influence, and one sphere of influence was to go to Spain, and the other half would go to Portugal. So they would never be fighting against each other. That was the kind of thinking there, So then they raped and pillaged and burned their way through Gujarat and various other places. But, basically they were only really, it was on the sea, they dominated the whole situation, and they had guns which no one else could match. So this enabled them to control India. But what really happened then was that in about 1600 or whatever, the Dutch then managed to build up a navy which was much bigger than the Portuguese, and eventually they destroyed the Portuguese. I mean, they had a massive navy. Meanwhile, the English had moved in, but the English were not really interested in fighting. The English just wanted to come and do some peaceful trade. In fact, they were under very strict instructions to do peaceful trade. The governors back in London said, look, we don't want you getting involved in any fighting or any of this kind of nonsense, You're just there to trade, and that will make money for us. So that's a very different approach. You'll see that later things rather changed in that respect, So that was really the situation, and there were various other people. The Danes arrived in about 1620, but because of wars in Europe, which they were involved in, they never really managed to do very much, actually. All these countries exported slaves. And it's something which has actually not really been written about very much, I don't think. I mean, the transatlantic slave trade is, you know, there are, I don't know how many books about that, you know. But there were a lot of slaves taken from India, and they were shipped to the east. So a lot of them ended up, in particular, in Indonesia, working on Dutch plantations in Indonesia. So there was a big trade of, you know, thousands and thousands of slaves every year being captured and sent off to the Far East, you know. So that's really the thing. Now, the French then also arrived. They were a bit late on the scene, actually, but they arrived, and of course, they caused a lot of trouble for the British. And really, I would say that it was only the French arriving which ended up with the British conquering India, because what actually happened was that there were these there was wars going on in Europe between the British and the French. There were efforts made to try and say, well, we won't get involved in this in India, but then they did get involved. And that ended up with the British building up big armies in order to defeat the French. And then ultimately, when they defeated the French, they had a big army. What are we going to do with this? We've got this huge army, we've got all these people. Maybe we'll kind of take over some other parts of India, you see. I mean, you really do not want lots of unemployed soldiers around, you know. So that...
Ask the Afghans.
That's, yes, yeah. So that is the nub of the matter, really. So that's just a kind of quick overview. There's chapters in this book on the Portuguese, there's chapters on the Dutch, there's chapters on the Danes, there's chapters on the French, and then ends up with a chapter on the British, but only up to Clive, and I'm making no judgments about whether the Raj as altogether was good or bad. I'll leave that for Shashi. But
we'll have plenty of judgment.
Yes. But all I can say is it didn't start off well, you know, I mean, lots of people died, as I'm sure Shashi will tell you, in Bengal in the first few years of the British, you know. In fact, probably they killed 1/3 of the whole population indirectly, you know. We're talking about 10 million people dying. So, you know, this is not something for the British to be proud of. So that's an overview of my book, really.
Thank you.
Yes,
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I thought I'll jump right from there because I wanted to quote Roy when he said he wasn't passing any judgments. Page 234, which is the second last page of his book. He says, it seems likely that in the first 13 years of British rule, more harm was done to the people of India than by all the other European invaders of the centuries before. And that's essentially the curtain raiser, as it were.
Yes.
The curtain raiser for my own book, which essentially makes the point, which is implicit, I think, in Roy's as well, that this was an incredibly rich, prosperous, and sophisticated economy. According to the historian Angus Madison, it was the richest country in the world up to 1700, going back to the days of the Roman Empire. It contributed 27% of global GDP at that time. By comparison, today the US is about 23% of global GDP. The revenues of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1700 exceeded those of all the crowned heads of Europe put together, including Louis and Versailles, including the people in Buckingham Palace, the whole lot. His revenues alone dwarf the entire continent of Europe. But this rich and prosperous country was reduced in a couple of centuries of British loot, pillage, and depredation into a poster child for poverty, destitution, disease, and illiteracy. And the saga of this is the saga of what the British did to India. So what I've tried to do in my book, and I'm afraid 10 minutes isn't enough to do justice to it, I really will skim the surface of the argument, is I've tried, first of all, to chart descriptively, pretty much picking up from where... Is the mic not good enough?
It's sort of coming and going a little bit. But...
Is this better? All right. So I pick up roughly from where Roy left off to describe the way in which the British destroyed or deindustrialized India, destroying, for example, the flourishing textile industry, which had not just flourished for 2,000 years, but was at that point the leading textile industry in the world, as well as the leading exporter of textiles in the world, and not just any old cloth, but extremely fine cottons, linens, and muslins, the famous Dhaka gauzes, light as woven air, it was said, so fine that they could be pulled through, an entire sari could be pulled through a ring. In fact, there's written documentary evidence of British shopkeepers in the late 17th and 18th centuries trying to pass off shoddy European-made goods as made in India, because made in India was the hallmark of extremely high-quality textiles. And in any case, that was completely destroyed. The looms were smashed. In at least one episode recounted by a Dutch contemporary, challenged by British historians, I will concede. The thumbs of weavers were cut off, so they couldn't weave again. But there is no question that Murshidabad and Dhaka, the two big centers in eastern Bengal of textile production, were depopulated as a result of the deindustrialization, large numbers of people flocking to the land because they could no longer practice their trade. And so it goes, shipbuilding, steel. Steel, it's very interesting, you know, Indians had the earliest steel technology in the world. The Arabs came and learned it from here and from India and made what was called Damascus steel. And when the East India Company soldiers killed Indians in their early battles, they always made it a point to dismount and steal the Indian swords, because the swords are made of a finer steel than any available in Europe. But all of this steel was destroyed, shipbuilding was destroyed. But in addition to the deindustrialization of the country, there was also rapacious taxation. Again, extensively documented, and we owe a lot to the moralistic but passionate impeachment of Warren Hastings in the late 18th century, when there was excruciating detail given about the tortures inflicted upon people who couldn't pay the taxes, which sometimes were as high as 95% of the crop. There were horrendous amounts drawn from people. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't some rapacity in the past as well, in the days of the Mughal Empire, but the traditional cultural practice in India was always that, for example, if there was a drought, then taxes were either not levied or dramatically reduced. If there was a marriage in the peasant's family or a death in the family, taxes weren't levied. There was always this kind of adjustment. But the British did everything by the book. So it was, this is what you have to pay, and you pay it come what may. And vast quantities were extracted from these people. And unlike the Mughals and the earlier years, much of this was sent off to England, so that it was not just that there was loot and pillage, but that none of it remained in India or was spent in India. It was sent off to be spent in England. So a common practice, for example, Robert Clive was already mentioned, who literally helped himself to the contents of the various treasuries he conquered, went off, bought himself a seat in Parliament, paid off his debts, got himself eventually a peerage, became a rich man. Thomas Pitt, the governor of Madras in the beginning of the 18th century, stole a diamond known as the Pitt diamond, which, when he sold it to the Duc d'Orléans, made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe, enabled him again to buy himself a seat in Parliament, buy himself a big manor in the country, and found a political dynasty that gave the United Kingdom 2 prime ministers, the Earl of Chatham and William Pitt the Younger. So this kind of overt looting and pillage. And there's a lot of material in the book that I don't have time to go into about the so-called nabobs, as they were called, who came back from India with their ill-gotten loot and who built opulent mansion after opulent mansion here, and in many ways transformed the life and politics of early 18th century Britain as well, late 18th, I beg your pardon, and early 19th century Britain as well. So there's all of that, and I describe it in some detail. There is also British culpability in a number of other things. A deliberate policy on famines. 35 million Indians died, totally unnecessary deaths. And I say this consciously because of British policy. There'd always been droughts in India, but they'd been dealt with by various forms of local charity. People weren't allowed to just die on the street. But the British had a consistent set of principles. They were, number one, thou shalt not interfere with the market. By the way, it's very ironic that the British did so much in the name of free trade while destroying the free trade that had been practiced until they came. As Roy points out, Calicut was a trade haven for 1,000 years. There were flourishing communities of Arabs and Chinese and many other nationalities because everyone could come and trade in peace. No one was interfered with. Security was fantastic. It was only the Europeans who came and disrupted that. So in the name of their free trade, they destroyed the free trade that had been practiced earlier. But coming back to the famines, so free trade principle, if people can't afford to buy grain, the laws of the market will apply, let them die. Second principle, the Malthusian one, if the land cannot sustain the population that's trying to live off it, then again let them die. And the third principle, a little more bourgeois, was thou shalt not spend money that is not budgeted for. So if people unexpectedly are dying, well, that's not your problem. So, by the way, this is exactly the same set of policies the British applied in Ireland, which is why in the 1840s Great Potato Blight, so many died and so many fled, got into ships and went off to America. But we didn't have that option in India, so people died under the eyes of the British, and those people of conscience who tried to help were prevented from doing so. I have one anecdote in the book about Mr. McMinn, a suspiciously Irish name, who was warned by the British that his attempts to help a man starving in front of him would result in his deportation back to the British Isles if he continued. So that was the kind of approach, and I've obviously borrowed extensively with appropriate citations from other people's scholarship and research in all of this. So there's a long catalogue of indictments. I'm restraining myself from describing Winston Churchill's appalling conduct in what became known as the Great Bengal Famine, but I'll be happy to answer questions about it. I'm sorry? No. But then the second part of the book is, having laid out the case, I then take up the arguments that are made in favor of the empire. The obvious ones, allegedly, the political unity of India, the rule of law, the railways, all of this may be true, but we gave them the railways. And everything right down to the English language, tea and cricket. And in every single instance, as I demonstrate with chapter and verse, these were all things that were brought in not for the benefit of the Indians, but specifically to serve the purposes of enhanced British control over the subcontinent, or British profit, or often both. And I don't know how much time we have left. I can go into one of these examples. If you take railways, for instance, the railways were explicitly conceived. So in conception, in execution, and in the way in which it was implemented. The railways were conceived as an exercise to extract resources from the interior of the country, which is more inaccessible on horseback or whatever, in order to take it to the ports and ship it to England, ship them to England, and also to send troops into the interior to control any potential unrest. When the railways were then to be built, it was ensured that it would be paid for entirely out of Indian taxes, but investments came in from English investors who then made a guaranteed profit. The single most profitable investment you could make on the London Stock Exchange between the late 1840s and the mid-1870s was in guaranteed Indian Railway securities, which offered returns double the highest paying British government treasury securities at that time. And because the interest was guaranteed, because somebody else was paying for it, the Indians were, they spent money handsomely. In fact, each mile of Indian railway when it was built, cost 9 times the same mile being built in the US or Canada at the same time. So it was a gigantic colonial scam. It was called private profit at public risk, except the public risk was all Indian and the private profit was all English or British. Having built the railways, they then ran it as a completely racist enterprise. So that right up to the First World War, every single position of consequence except the most menial, from station masters to ticket collectors to the chairman of the railway board, had to be an Englishman, had to be a European, other whites were acceptable. It was only when the First World War killed a whole lot of them and there was a sudden shortage of able-bodied white men to do this work that they started looking for Indians to do some of these things, and they hired Anglo-Indians, the Indian Eurasians, whose identification with railways began around then, and so on. But again, I go into much more detail about that. When people talk about the railways being a boon for moving people around, fact remains that when these third-class railway carriages with wooden slats for benches on which Indians were to travel were attached to these trains, the Indian passengers paid the highest passenger rates in the world, whereas British companies paid the lowest freight rates in the world to use the railways. It was only after independence that whatever railway lines were constructed to serve the interests of the public, that passenger rates are now the lowest in the world, and freight rates, sadly, so high that many of our Indian companies are shipping their goods by lorry on the congested highways of India. So we've gone too far to the other extreme. But the fact is, at least after independence, the railways were turned around to serve Indian interests, which they were not before independence. I'm going to stop there simply because I think I've done my 10 minutes, but there's obviously a lot more detail in the book, and I'll be very happy to respond to questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you. You can't tell them everything, otherwise you want to sell copies of your book, don't you?
I do want them to read the book, yes.
So, one question, let me raise a couple of questions before we open it up. One thing which is evident from both your summaries and what you've written, a question that does arise is there a qualitative difference in Britain's dealing with India compared to the Portuguese, the French, and the Dutch who come before them? Is there a different kind, a different texture of engagement which is noticeable? What is noticeable, and of course historians have written about this, that the European engagement in trade marked a complete departure to the way trade was conducted before they came in, right? So they changed the terms of trade in so many different ways. Gunpowder plays a very important role in it. That's one question. The second, which I think, Roy, it'll be great to hear from you, but Shashi, you can address it too. The second question, which is more provocative, partly because sort of to take your argument forward, and once we are able to sort of go beyond the anger, is to whether the British story, given it's a much longer period of time, what is happening? Your account at the moment, India aims to have 10% growth. At any point, we want 10% growth and above, right? So 6, 7, whatever. But we also know the reality of that growth is that most people at the bottom don't feel the benefits of it. No? So when we talk about India being this very strong economy, how much of it was felt at the bottom? Is this a top-heavy elite that enjoys the wealth, which of course shows up in some of the reports that the people you quote are writing letters back to Europe? That's one thing. So, what kind of strong economy is India? Is it a fair society? And secondly, is there a more textured account of the empire possible, where we can see a variety of voices which come out in some moments? Hastings' impeachment is a fantastic one. So the debate actually that happens in Britain is a very interesting one. Dyer is another one. And you see what wins in the end, but the fact that there is a plurality of opinions about the pillage, about the violence, about the complete and utter exploitation makes the story a little bit more interesting, doesn't it? So it'll be great if you can talk about that a little bit. But Roy, do you want to talk about the difference between the Europeans and the British a little bit, or isn't there one?
Well, I don't know if there's any great difference. I mean, I don't know who said it, but I mean, somebody said no country conquers another in order to benefit that country's inhabitants. I mean, that's the way it is, and it's the way it's always been. And I can assure you that when the dreaded French arrived in England with William the Conqueror, I mean, they weren't coming here to do us good at all, they were doing it for themselves. And I think that's the same with all these things. It would be naive to imagine that anybody would do anything else, actually. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'd simply chip in that as your own book demonstrates, the Portuguese were probably far crueler. At the beginning, they would gratuitously attack and kill and maim. Yeah. Thereafter, of course, all the Europeans did it, but probably there were, purely in terms of the violence inflicted, there was a different order of magnitude when the Europeans came, and unprovoked violence in particular. Yeah. The second thing was that Indians, and I speak particularly from the perspective of southern India, Kerala, which had historically been open for trade for a couple of thousand years, were used to people of various backgrounds coming and trading in peace. What was new was people coming with guns and imposing their terms of trade, as it were, at the point of a gun. That was a European innovation, and we'd had Arabs and Chinese and Moors and God knows who else coming to Kerala literally for 2,000 years without disturbing anybody else, and none had committed violence, none had had violence committed upon them. They were encouraged to come and trade. So that was another departure. And the third thing is, I suppose, the way in which they colonized. You again have references, Roy, in your book to how the Portuguese had no real difficulty in intermixing with the locals, whereas the Brits did. And while initially there were no British women around, and therefore they ended up having to, as it were, satisfy themselves with locals, or the products of earlier mixed marriages, including Portuguese, part Portuguese, largely Indian women. Then when the fishing fleet comes in the beginning of the 19th century of British spinsters looking for British men, the racism becomes very deeply entrenched in a way in which it wasn't, for example, in the Portuguese colonies. So these are all, I think, fairly significant differences. And one last point is when you mentioned the French, I think it's fair to say the British could not have defeated Dupleix in India were it not for the fact that the French made the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, where they had to essentially order him to return Madras, which he had captured, to the British.
Yeah, sure. No, that's absolutely true. Yeah, just a slight diversion here, talking about Portuguese cruelty. What happened in Vasco de Gama's second expedition was the Raja of Calicut sent an emissary to try and negotiate with him. And this was a Brahmin who came, but Vasco de Gama wondered, well, maybe this guy's a spy. So he roasted him over a fire until he admitted that he was a spy. And then what he did then was he cut his ears off.
And his lips.
And then he cut the ears off the ship's dog and he sewed them onto the Brahmin. And then he filled the Brahmin's mouth full of bacon and shit, and then sewed it up and sent him back. So, actually, I don't think the British did that kind of thing, actually. So,
they had other innovations. Were you going to answer my question about...
Sorry, what was your question to me? Because I was too captivated by your question.
You didn't hear my long question?
No, I did. Just remind me in one sentence.
A more textured account of 300 years of multiplicity of British opinion?
Yeah, I mean, look, sure. I mean, there obviously... There were a number of impacts of British rule in India, which we're all living with, including the language in which we're speaking about all of this. But the fact is that when you write a work of what I suppose I'll have to admit is popular history, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. I mean, you have to anchor yourself on demonstrably true things. that doesn't prevent another writer from picking up other demonstrably true things and constructing a totally different narrative. And I'm very happy to accept that other narratives are possible. This is mine. I thought it was necessary, particularly because in the first decade of the 21st century, there's been so much of rather blatant revisionism about empire, with Neil Ferguson writing about how it laid the foundations for globalization and how it was a jolly good thing with a capital J, capital G, and a capital T. And Lawrence James talking about how it was the British Empire was the single greatest experiment in benign altruism in all of human history, which wants to make you choke, but after a while you say, no, the empire can write back. And that's what I've tried to do is to write back.
I have to say, as an academic who's taught in British universities for the last 24 years, the irony of this debate is entirely lost on anyone under the age of 60 in this country, because simply children are not taught the story of the British Empire in their history curriculum. So there is actually no engagement with this story by the mainstream population of Britain at all.
The week my book came out in India, a Pakistani journalist wrote an article in The Guardian saying she'd raised 2 kids who had been to one of the best public schools in London. They'd done A-levels in history and they hadn't learned a word of colonial history. That is basically the actual reality of the way in which historical amnesia has triumphed in Britain. You've got these gauzy romanticized soap operas and so on about the colonial period, but very little. I mean, I'm sure that everything in Roy's book would come to them as utterly bewildering information. And so the truth is that people often ask me, so what's the point of all this? It's 70 years ago, the Brits have left, who cares anymore? My answer, first of all, to young Indians is, well, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? But thank you. But beyond that, I just want to say that I do hope that somebody in Britain will also wake up and do 2 things. I mean, I don't seek reparations. There's been a misunderstanding about that because I spoke in the Oxford Union debate where the topic happened to be about reparations, but even there I said a symbolic £1 a year for the next 200 years will do me fine. Because frankly, no payable amount is credible and no credible amount is payable. So how do you put a value on these 200 years, including the value on those lives lost? But the 2 things I would want to demand, I would say, of Britain would be, first of all, atonement. And I know there are many Brits who feel, well, why should we atone for something we haven't done? It was all our ancestors a long time ago, and who do we apologize to since the victims have all since passed on? But the point is that there are important precedents. There's Willy Brandt sinking to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto, even though Brandt, as a social democrat, was innocent of any taint of Nazi wrongdoings and was somebody who had been persecuted by the Nazis as a social democrat. And there he is as Chancellor of Germany apologizing to the Polish people and the Polish Jews in particular for the atrocities done in the name of his country. And the other example is Justin Trudeau last year in Canada, apologizing in the Canadian Parliament to the people of India for the Komagata Maru incident 102 years earlier, in which a Japanese ship with Indian refugees was turned away at gunpoint from the port of Vancouver, and many of the people on board, most of them, either perished on the high seas or met a grisly end at British hands afterwards. And again, Trudeau could well have said the same things, why should I do it, nothing to do with me, but he felt it necessary and it was a fine gesture. You mentioned Jallianwala Bagh earlier, Mukulika. The single worst atrocity in my view, I mean, Willie Dalrymple has pointed out rightly that in terms of numbers, it pales by comparison because 100,000 people were butchered in Delhi in 1858 after the so-called Sepoy Mutiny was put down. But it's not the numbers, it's everything that preceded it, accompanied it, and followed it. It is the fact that, that the British broke their promises which had elicited Indian support during the First World War for the British war effort, in which India supplied not only 1.3 million soldiers to fight for the Brits, and 80,000 of whom died, and another 78,000 were wounded and severely crippled for life. But apart from all of that, India also supplied treasure, money, vehicles, pack animals, food, clothing, uniforms, all of this amounting to something like 80 million pounds sterling in today's money, and 80 billion pounds sterling in today's money to fight the war effort. And at the end of all of that, they expected, Mahatma Gandhi and others expected, that dominion status would follow. That's what they understood Britain to mean when they talked about progressively responsible self-governance. Instead of which the British actually broke their word and reimposed wartime restrictions in the draconian Rowlatt Acts. That betrayal was followed by protests across British India, particularly in Punjab. And the protests were put down ruthlessly through a form of martial law, with senior soldiers being sent to each of the major Punjabi towns. General Dyer was sent to Amritsar, where it happened to be the Baisakhi festival. And large numbers of peasants, almost certainly unaware of the martial law regulations, had assembled in this walled garden, unarmed obviously, perhaps to hear some protest speeches as well, but mainly to commemorate Baisakhi. Large numbers of women and children were there. And Dyer arrives, doesn't shout a warning, doesn't fire a warning shot, just orders his troops to fire directly into the unarmed, defenseless, screaming men, women, and children. Practically no bullet doesn't take a toll. Everybody either is hit by a bullet, dies, or is injured. He positions the soldiers at the only gate, so that people fleeing from the carnage are the easiest targets to kill. At the end of all that, he barricades the gates, and for 24 hours, no one is allowed to tend to the dead, the dying, and the wounded. So their bodies are rotting in the hot sun, and the dying are wailing out piteously for even water, which their relatives can't give them. Dyer orders Indians to crawl on their bellies on a street, and if they so much as lift their heads while crawling, they are hit on the head with British staves. And at the end of all of this, when of course the inevitable public outrage follows, the House of Commons condemns Dyer, the House of Lords says he's wonderful and passes a resolution praising him, and the British raise money to the tune in today's money of £250,000 sterling to reward him for his misdeeds, with that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, calling him the man who saved India. So all of this happens. Dyer says openly to the official commission of inquiry that he'd do it again. He's proud of what he'd done. And this entire thing, the betrayal, the cruelty, the brutality of the massacre, the racism that follows and accompanies it, and then the self-justification and the reward, put together makes this, in my view, the single worst atrocity of the British Raj. Now imagine if on the centenary of that atrocity, on the 13th of April 2019, a member of the British royal family, because after all everything was done in the name of the crown, were to come to Amritsar and seek forgiveness from the people of India on that day for that, and by extension all the sins this symbolizes. What a wonderfully cleansing act that would be. So atonement, and the other is education. Teach it in your schools, for God's sake.
No,
I know at university level you guys are doing a good job. It's the schools that don't.
In fact, the Traders Gallery in the National Maritime Museum, it's relatively recent, about 6 or 7 years old, is definitely a very economical way to teach students about the empire. It's got a wonderful collection of paintings, of one of them being the Royal Navy and the French fighting it out in the Indian Ocean. And you really wouldn't know why they are in battle in the Indian Ocean unless you knew the story of the empire. But about the Jallianwala Bagh, I might not get a chance to say this again, but if it has to happen in 2019, we have 2 years. It's all very well to sit here and clap at the idea. I think it's going to happen only if there's a campaign. And there are people who live here in Britain who need to, I think the ownership of the campaign has to come from British friends as much as Indians and British working together. I think that's how it's going to happen. Okay, we have less than 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to take 3 questions to start with. Please keep them brief. I'm sure your comments are very interesting, but please don't make them here. Just ask a short, brief question, and you can talk to the authors afterwards. So let's start with, oh, I'm looking for women. I can see only men. At the back, oh, Can you take it as I saw them? Right at the back, please. Please keep going. Third row from the back. No, here, look to your right. Yeah, great. And the next question is a gentleman just 2 rows down. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Talk yesterday about the...
Can you speak into the microphone?
Yeah, I was in a very interesting talk yesterday about the South Asian treasures at the British Library, where my obvious question, and the library is going through a big digitization process. And my question is, I mean, it relates a little bit to the reparations, especially now that everything is going to be digitized. Should these documents and these manuscripts not go to their rightful owners? Especially like when I hear of things like the Akbarnama, the original manuscript being here and not being where it belongs. The response I got was, these countries do not know how to handle these things. I want these documents to be safe, but these countries are not very good at how they conserve things, which, I mean, I come from India. I know how bad a job we do at our museums, but this is about the same response or the same mentality that the British had when they were going around colonizing the world, because they said that these people don't know how to be civil, how to live, and we are just teaching them that.
Okay, thank you.
So what's your point of view?
Thanks. Okay, gentleman in front.
Can I ask about what was your best response be to the complicity of the Indian elite at the time, which is constantly raised as a point, the complicity of the England, the royal family's elite. What is the best way to unpick that argument and how that extends into the current elite of India? Thank you.
And if you can pass the microphone down that, over
As a working class, a British person who came from a working class family said that his forefathers were treated in a similar way. They were exploited, they were oppressed, and cruelty was committed against them. So they were saying that it was really the aristocracy and the colonialists who behaved that way, and they behaved that way with the Indians as well as with the working class British. So I'd just like your views on that.
Okay. And is there a question right next to you? Was there somebody there? No. Okay. Do you want to?
Well, I'm a book and manuscript conservator, and that's what I did as a profession. And I've been around a lot of book and manuscript conservation facilities in India, and let me tell you, most of them are rubbish. I mean, really, I was unbelievable. And often, especially if it's a government institution, you can kind of arrive there and where is everybody? Oh, well, they took the day off because their grandfather died or something, but you might get 10% of the people there. I mean, it's unbelievable. The only good place I ever went to, actually, was the one in Lucknow. I mean, really, I know it's an unpalatable truth, but I, having been a conservator and gone round a lot of these places, that is the way I see it,
Thank you. Shashi, do you want to respond to the other?
Different questions. Yeah. There are 3 different questions that have come up. So before I lose track of them, maybe I should work backwards.
Working class.
I beg your pardon?
Working class. I was just reminding.
Yeah. No, on the point of the working class, I think they're actually quite right, which is why I'm not asking them to apologize. I'm asking for the Crown or the Prime Minister or somebody from the elite to do so. In fact, Roy has a couple of quotes from European officers and bosses about the men fighting for them, and the words they use are scum and refuse and that sort of. That's how they thought of their own soldiers. Yeah. The people who were fighting for the Dutch and the English were regarded by their superior officers as scum, and they were themselves Dutch or English. So that particularly, I think, resonates with the evidence. On the question of conservation, it's a tough one. I'm very torn because Roy has a point that standards, whether for reasons of resource availability or for simple reasons of attitude, as he describes it, that conservation hasn't necessarily been given the kind of attention and the kind of quality that anyone would like to see. There are institutions where that is changing. I'm told the National Archives are now in much better shape. The National Museum certainly now has a museum university that is training a new generation of conservators, and surely there will be institutions that can preserve anything. But I'm sorry to say the conversation is essentially academic because nobody's going to give any of this back. When David Cameron was asked on an earlier visit to England about the Kohinoor, his answer was, it's got to stay put, I'm afraid, because if we give it back, within weeks the British Museum would be empty. I mean, the British Museum is essentially a chor bazaar. I mean, it's a crime scene. I mean, everything in the British Museum came from somewhere else. And the British had no right to take it when they did, but they did anyway because who was going to stop them? So now, given that reality, I think we have to accept that things will stay where they are. But I hope that those who possess these things will see them, if you like, as a trusteeship, as something they're preserving as part of the heritage of all of humanity, and would make it accessible to people, particularly, I would hope, people from the places of origin of these things. I'm told there's an appalling number of things sitting in basements and storage in the V&A and the British Museum, which would adorn a museum in India, and they haven't been displayed in decades. So I don't know whether it's entirely reasonable that all of these things should be out of sight of those who actually could benefit from it. In fact, when I was here last, one of my dialogues on my book was, in fact, with Tristram Hunt at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So there was something piquant about that entire conversation. I think we haven't answered the very first question, have we?
No, the second question.
Which was about?
I can't remember.
One word. Oh, the complicity of the Indian elites, totally. I mean, I mentioned that throughout the book, and so will others. But every colonial experience has had its so-called native informants, its compradors, it's the people who benefited from British rule. In fact, I had an amusing experience when one of the events, my book, when I came around to launch it in March, the Indian High Commissioner rather cheerfully confessed that his ancestors had all been given grand titles by the British and had prospered under the British, but that nonetheless meant that he didn't disagree with me, but complicity was widespread. The point is you can't, I'm afraid, get away from that in any colonial situation, and that's true of India too. The larger question is, India as a whole, did it benefit or not? There's others who argue, for example, well, didn't the Mughals or the other rulers before them also loot and pillage? To which the answer is, with the exception of the handful of invaders who came, took the loot and left, everybody else spent their loot in India. And as a result, therefore, the country benefited. And indeed, whatever the Mughals may have done, they also brought in wonderfully talented artists, musicians, sculptors, painters, etc., from Persia, Central Asia, and so on, who've enriched our culture and our civilization. So there is a difference between that and the British Empire. One thing I mentioned, for example, in the book is how when the British became the new ruling caste, the Indian luxury industry collapsed because the old aristocrats, the old elites, were the ones paying all these craftsmen and jewelers and so on, and fine fabric makers and so on to give them their luxury items. But now the new elite was only interested in luxuries from Paris and London, or in shipping their money back to finance homes and lives in the UK.
Shashi, we've got 2 more minutes.
No, we've got more than 2 minutes, sure.
No, we don't. So I'll lose my job. Yeah. So very quickly, 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, I'll try to be 30 seconds. So I'm interested in the date that at which your book stops, 1765, because I think that's very critical. Till 1761, especially the Third Battle of Panipat, I don't think the history of South Asia was conclusive. There was no fait accompli as far as the colonial domination of this area was concerned. 1498, when Portuguese first came and attacked Calicut, till 1761, they were fighting, or they were trying to establish trade and routes within a power structure which was far superior to them. And this 1761 Battle of Panipat, where the Marathas couldn't align with Jats of Bharatpurs and the Sikhs of Punjab, was the nailing coffin in the Indian independence and in its ability to stay free and with its own resources. And I just want to hear whether that was your reason for stopping it at 1765, or just a Curia Buxer reference, which I think is a hogwash.
I just needed a break and to...
Fantastic. Okay, last question.
Actually, he doesn't mention Panipat or Buxar, but you're right on this.
Yeah.
However, the period is logical in terms of the European.
Can I just say something about, the fact that, a lot of people have said the biggest oppressor of Indians was other Indians. And, this is something to be borne in mind. Obviously, I'm very conscious of this because of my friendship with Pulin Devi and, what happened to people. I mean, she wasn't actually a Dalit, but she was pretty close to it, And then, it's unbelievable when you think about it. I mean, in Kerala, for example, an untouchable was not only untouchable, he was unapproachable, so could not walk within less than 65 feet of a Nair warrior or 90 feet of a Brahmin. Now, none of that was imposed by the British. And then 2 years ago, I was actually in Tamil Nadu, and I was in Madurai. And a delegation of Dalits asked to see me. And they came and told me about the terrible conditions they're living in their villages. And, this is 2 years ago, and they were saying, for example, that, they couldn't get the land which the government had promised them because, the people, the higher caste just wouldn't kind of let them have it. And then they also told me they were never allowed to walk through a village with their shoes on. They had to take them off to walk through the villages. This is 2 years ago in India. So, that also has to be thought about.
I'm afraid we are out of time. Unless the organizers give us, no, we can't. This is the British Library, after all. They'll allow us only a certain amount of time to have these subversive discussions. It remains for me to...
One last question.
Lady has a mic in her hand.
Quickly.
I am a Syrian Christian from Kerala, a community that has been Christian for about 2,000 years. And when the Portuguese arrived, oral tradition says that they came looking for spices and souls for Christ. And they declared the original Christians as heretics. So how far did religion play a role in the atrocities that the Portuguese committed in Kerala and elsewhere?
Shashi, can I do a quick one? Shashi, you can't possibly dismiss the benefits that were left behind by the British when they left simply because it benefited the British while they were while they were ruling. It's rather like the parallel to that is that you can't praise anything that the Congress Party's done while it's been in power, your Congress Party, because it's been benefiting the re-election of the Gandhi dynasty, and everything has been designed to get the Gandhi dynasty perpetuated. So how can you possibly argue that there were no benefits left behind by the British?
Well, that's a spin. Do you want to respond? Do you want to respond first?
I think Roy should first respond.
The one on religion, the serious question.
Well, the one on religion, obviously with the Portuguese, the British, actually, that's one thing they did not do, was in any way try to impose religion. And in fact, the East India Company took...
The Inquisition was going on at the time, sure. The Inquisition was going on.
I'm talking about the British, sorry.
I think you said the Portuguese.
I say the Portuguese. That was a slip of my tongue. They certainly brought the Inquisition into Goa, yes. No, the Portuguese were quite different in that way, really, although their main thing was to make money and to the rest of it. But I agree. They did impose religion, and they imposed rules, which meant if you didn't become a Catholic, then you would be suffering various financial penalties. There's no doubt about it. They were doing that. But what I meant to say was the British, for a long time, it was a very strict thing. They would not get involved in religion in India. And the various Christian missionaries wanted to go out to India, and the East India Company stopped that happening. And it was only later on, when the British government took control of the East India Company, that they were allowed in.
Absolutely right. In fact, the first British bishop, as I mentioned in the book, only showed up in 1820, whereas the Portuguese, the religious leaders were following from the second ship onwards. And for them, it was a very big deal. And sadly, for example, the only persecution of Jews on Indian soil took place because the Portuguese persecuted them as part of the Inquisition. So it was different. The Portuguese were different from the Brits on the religious front. John. Oh, I won't duck your question, John. You've engaged in a particular philosophical or logical fallacy by comparing two completely unrelated categories of things. If the Congress Party did something in order to win votes, and the votes then return them to office, that's called democracy. But if I can come back to the other philosophical question you need to ask, it's the old classic question, cui bono? For whose benefit? And my argument is that the British were conscious throughout that they were in it for the money, they were in it for their own benefit, and the justifications came later. They only came after 1857-58. Until then, they were quite open about what they were doing. But later, the language was what it was, but it was not only rather hypocritical and self-serving, but the British admitted it to themselves. So I've quoted, for example, Lord Lytton writing to Queen Victoria, whose favorite poet he was, that you've said that we have to associate Indians with the administration, and we're doing that. We've given them these positions, but we can't really give them any authority. You do realize that, don't you? And you've got, as late as the 1920s, the Home Secretary of Britain, Sir William Hicks, saying behind closed doors, it is said that we are in India to rule it for the benefit of the Indians. That is just so much cant. We seized India by the sword, and we shall rule it with the yardstick, and we are going to do so for the benefit of Britain for the foreseeable future. This is as late as the 1920s. So in private, the British were very honest about why they were there. There was a lot of window dressing, a certain amount of hypocrisy, and of course the fact is that the 19th century liberal enlightenment, it was necessary to talk about the civilizing mission and all these wonderful things, omitting the fact that there was already a highly flourishing civilization with all its iniquities and other things, but there was a flourishing civilization before the British got there. The fact is that these things had to be said almost as much to appease British public opinion, which wanted to believe they were doing something virtuous. But privately, the British elite, I think, had no illusions about what they were up to, and they say so. I've also said in the book there are lots of good people who came. Not everybody was a horrendous, self-serving racist. There were civil servants. There were. I mean, I've given a number of examples. Sir Arthur Cotton is still remembered in the Godavari Delta for having irrigated the cotton fields of the Godavari that never had happened before in history, and so on and so forth. So there are good stories, but the overall purpose of these people to be in India was the perpetuation of the British Empire, whose overall purpose was the benefit of Britain. I rest my case.
Thank you. Thank you, Roy. Moxham. Thank you, Shashi. Thank you, Mukulika. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.